Good morning. At least it's morning now that I'm doing this. I have no idea when you're watching it. The Reddit has asked me to respond to some questions. My name is Barney Frank. I'm a member of Congress. Let me begin with Gary P. 714. Congressman Frank, H.R. 1207 currently has over 300 co-sponsors in the House, and the recent Rasmussen poll indicates that 75% of Americans are in favor of a more detailed order of the Fed. Yet despite this overwhelming support, it still sits gathering dust. Will we see within Obama's first term an actual open book order of the Fed? Well, frankly, the question's kind of unfair. It is not gathering dust. Ron Paul is the main sponsor of this bill. He filed it first in 1983, 26 years ago. I was then a second-term member of the House. Mr. Paul then left the House because he ran for president on the Libertarian ticket. He came back to the House. Shortly after he came back to the House, the Republicans took over the Congress. During the 12 years that the Republicans ran Congress until 2007, not only was no action taken on that bill, Ron Paul himself, under Republican rule, was by seniority in 2003 in line to be chairman of the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over the Federal Reserve. The Republican leadership, because they were protecting the Fed from Ron Paul, abolished that subcommittee and merged it with another. Ron, by the way, has publicly acknowledged this. 2 years later, he was then in line under seniority to become chairman of the subcommittee into which they'd merged it. So they persuaded another Republican who was senior to him in the House to come back onto the committee and again knocked him out. And Ron said to me at the time, I guess I'll have to wait until you're chairman, I was the senior Democrat, to get any power. Well, that turned out to be the case. The Democrats took over in 2007. I told Ron I wanted to work with him. We will, as people will remember, got a little bit knocked off by last year's financial crisis. But this year, in September, we had the first hearing ever on the bill that Ron Paul introduced in 1983. So I hardly think it's gathering dust. I've been chairman now. I'm into my third year, and we have moved on it. We are also working on amending it, and Congressman Paul knows this. We are going to include it in the overall bill for financial regulatory reform, and that's a protection for this because it can't be vetoed. It can't be filibustered by itself in the Senate. Generally, when you have something that's controversial, you try to put it in what's called a must-pass bill. So we are working on it. There was one change in it that I wanted to make that Ron Paul agrees with. The Federal Reserve buys and sells a lot of securities and financial instruments. You don't want that made public the day they do it, the minute they do it, because then other people will trade on it. It will affect the market. We do believe that everything the Federal Reserve buys and sells should be open to the public to deal with any fear that there's any favoritism or to check their judgments. So we are working. I talked to Ron about that just the other day. This is Friday. I think we talked about it on the floor yesterday, about a time period, perhaps 6 months, which will have to elapse before they make that public. So the answer is, frankly, after 12 years when Ron was being rebuffed by his own Republican Party, although he'd say it's maybe not his Republican Party, we are now moving on that bill. Next, from Fauster. Many of us are worried that a health care bill without a public option will amount to $1 trillion payment to an insurance industry that raises rates and quibbles over coverage. One Republican may vote with the Democrats on health care, potentially giving a filibuster a busting majority. Democrats are on the race of weakening or abandoning plans for a public option with a bipartisan bill, while a much stronger bill could be passed using reconciliation. Many congressmen said they would not support a bill without a public option. How ready are you and your colleagues to vote against a bill without the public option? Can progressives in the House make sure that no public option-free version becomes law? First of all, let me agree with one very important premise of this. This notion that it has to be bipartisan. Bipartisanship is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. The end is good legislation. If you can get better legislation by the Democrats working with a few Republicans, that's fine. If you can get better legislation by the Democrats doing it alone, that's fine. Bipartisanship is not a goal. And as a matter of fact, insisting that things be bipartisan is in some ways anti the democratic process because we have elections. One party wins and one party loses. To have an election in which one party wins and one party loses and then insist that the two parties do it equally, it kind of reduces the electoral process to a color war in camp. We don't just choose up teams. One party has one view and one party has another view. And I think for the party that wins an election, having made certain commitments, to then say, okay, but we can't follow through on our commitments unless the losers agree, betrays your commitment to democracy. I admire President Obama a great deal. I think he's been excellent. But I did get upset during his campaign when he said he was going to govern in a post-partisan manner. I know how, and part of the problem with bipartisanship is you're not talking about a Republican Party that's reasonable in many ways. Gerald Ford, the Republican president in the 70s who took over from Richard Nixon, is a dangerous liberal by the standards of the very right-wing people who hold the Republican Party's power today. So when the president says he's going to be post-partisan, in effect suggesting he's going to give a veto to these people, he gives me post-partisan depression. And I think what he's learned is, no, these are not reasonable people you can work with. These are people who cheer when an American city loses the Olympic Games, who are rooting for him to fail. So I don't want to do that. You know, we did have to pick up 3 Republicans on the economic recovery bill called the subsidy bill. I will explain to people that we call it the recovery bill because the political language experts had focus groups. And they reported back to us that you're not supposed to call it the subsidy bill. You should call it the recovery bill. It sounds better. I found that very odd. In my experience, most people would rather be stimulated than recover. So I don't know why it's better to say recovery than stimulus. But I wasn't in charge of that one. But to get the bill through, we needed 3 Republican senators, or they did in the Senate. The bill contained $25 billion less in aid to states. That's $25 billion that could have gone to preventing the layoff of policemen and teachers and firefighters and social workers and sanitation workers because 3 Republicans insisted on it. California went through great agony. If the Republicans hadn't been able to hold that bill up and extort that ransom, California would have had $2.5 billion more to avoid a great deal of the pain that the people of California went through. So I'm not for setting that up as a goal. There is one problem with the procedure called reconciliation. For those who don't spend all their time in the minutiae of parliamentary procedure, reconciliation is a way by which, through the budget, you can get a bill passed with 51 votes, even in the United States Senate, where majority rule does not exist, rather than having to get 60. The problem is that only some things are eligible for reconciliation and some are not. And it's not clear that a public option, for example, would fit under the reconciliation rules. Finally, yes, I'm very much for public option. Let's be very clear. The main objection to the public option from conservatives is that they're afraid that people will like it. They're afraid it will be too popular and it will therefore undermine the insurance companies. And the notion, by the way, that we have to depend on the insurance companies to protect us against the government so we don't have medical care denied to people who need it, there's a parallel universe out there in which that may be true, but I've never encountered it. The public option is precisely to give people an escape from the excesses and excess profits of the private companies. The final question is, can we get it done? I do not know. I am optimistic. Nancy Pelosi has been very tough now in insisting on the public option. Here's the final question. I'm not going to duck the question. Will we vote against it if it's not in there? The problem is, well, not the problem, but here's the deal. The public option is itself a means to an end of getting better insurance for more people at less cost. There are conceivable ways that you could achieve that goal without a public option. I am skeptical that people will be supporting them. So I'll wait and see what the final bill is. Well, I'm lobbying strongly for a public option. But if we have a bill that controls insurance company abuses and extends coverage substantially, I could vote for it, particularly for, I will tell you, if it's financed appropriately. You know, as we sit here today, we're reading about these massive bonuses that are being given out again on Wall Street. Now, we passed legislation in the House that would control those, but even with that legislation, they're still going to be getting a lot of money. One of the things that we proposed in the House, Congressman Rangel and others, was a surtax on the Americans' income above $300,000 a year. That would, if that was in there, that would make me be supportive. Next, from